Well, hello and welcome to Wild Vittles. Now, normally when I come to you on these podcasts, they're often cooking demonstrations, but you've noticed I've had a few interviews, and I want to continue to do that because I find that there are these interesting and amazing people out there that are also operating in this space, and I think that they've got something, they have a voice, they have something to say, and I want to bring that to you. And today I am extremely fortunate to bring to you Kriss Abigail. Now, Kriss Abigail is a professional butcher, an educator of wild game butchering, an advocate for bringing people into hunting, and she's also educating folks on the art of wild game butchering. And if you aren't following her on Instagram, you're really missing out. She's one of my favorite accounts to kind of watch. I think she's authentic, is the way that I would put it. I first met Kriss at a Texas BHA conservation conversation at the Star Hill Ranch, and I want to kind of share a story about that. But you actually won one of our raffles, and I think you won a rifle, which was
Yes.
really cool. And you were so excited, which I just thought was really neat. But before we do that, let me give a chance for you to kind of introduce yourself, Kriss. So, who is Kriss Abigail, and how did you become a butcher? And I've heard your story on other podcasts, which is really why I wanted to talk to you, because you were a very unlikely candidate to become a wild game butcher. And not only have you become what I would say a very skilled butcher, but now you're educating and you're advocating. How did you get there?
Oh man, it was a long way around to get to Texas. So I'm originally from El Salvador, and my family immigrated to Chicago when I was about a year and a half. And so I grew up in the middle of the Chicago city, and I always say that my exposure to nature was the lake and the local zoo that was also in the middle of the city. I was not exposed really to any hunting. Occasional family road trips. We drive through rural towns, and it was like a blink and you miss it kind of place, and which is funny because now I live in a blink and you miss it kind of place. Yeah, it's just wild. And so I would say about 20 years ago, my parents bought some property down here in the hill country. And, it was a family home. We would come and play at ranching. Um, and so when I was in Chicago, I was a professional photographer for about 10 years. And I specifically shot live performance, editorials, fashion. Once again, very different from the background that we're here now, right?
Right, right,
Um, and what happened was that my photography career essentially ended overnight. My equipment was stolen. And you build up 10 years of work, 10
right.
years of gear, you can't just go back to it overnight. And I really had to think about where I wanted my life to go. And my parents had retired down here to Texas, and it sort of felt like the perfect place to go and be able to breathe and figure things out. My friends called it my retirement. Nobody could quite believe that, this raised native Chicagoan city girl was going to go live in rural Texas. And I still remember when my friend Danny we drove down here, and we looked around, and she goes, "Oh, you are moving to the country." So it's definitely a 180 from the way that I had grown up and the life I knew. And there's a culture shock in a lot of ways, and trying to figure out where I fit in. The first year, I think I still spent it going to Austin. I spent it going to San Antonio, trying to figure out a city life here. And I thought about maybe I would go to culinary school. I'd love to cook. We would have dinner parties in Chicago. My father's from a line of chefs. It seemed as sort of the next natural progression. And so I went to the Culinary Institute of America in San Antonio and got some really great life advice from a counselor there. And they said to me to go work in a restaurant for 6 months and see if that was really what I wanted to do, and then come back and give them their money, because it's a very expensive
Right,
education.
right.
And so I said, okay. And so I did that for the 6 months, and it turned out that I do not like restaurant work. It was it was not the sort of pace that I was looking for in my life. And
Hmm.
so I went looking and I stumbled upon a Craigslist ad
Hmm.
that said game processing.
Hmm.
And I honestly had no idea what that meant. For me, game was, video games,
Right.
sports, things like that. I never had known that word to be associated with wildlife in any
Because
way.
you hadn't had any experience with hunting up into
Yeah,
this
I
point
had
either,
had
right?
zero experience with hunting. For
Right.
me, I didn't even know hunting was still a thing that people did. I didn't
Right.
know, I definitely came from a way of thinking that was biased against hunting,
Hmm.
everything's from a lack of exposure.
Right. We all
Uh,
have our own point of views kind of from the perspective of the experiences we
exactly,
have. And you wouldn't have had
exactly.
any other experience. I
I
understand that.
had, yeah, I hadn't had any other experience. And so, but what drew me was that it said learn knife skills. And so at that point, I was like, okay, that's something that like an aspiring chef should go
Hmm.
learn. And I went, and I think within the first 10 minutes, they gave me a knife and a leg, uh, and I stayed for about 7 years.
Hmm.
I stayed for about seven
Very
years.
cool.
I had the opportunity to be a chef over at a wedding ranch at the same time that I was starting out in butchery, and then I was also the pit master for a local barbecue place. So
Really?
I
Okay.
had,
I didn't
yeah,
realize that.
yeah, I had three very separate career paths that then I had to decide which one I could pursue. I was getting married, and my life was sort of changing, and I needed to
That
narrow
sounds
my
very
focus.
busy.
It was very busy, as three
Yeah.
jobs and all
Yeah.
that, which I loved. But um, butchery really spoke to me because it was the most challenging. It was the
Hmm.
most fun in the sense of I didn't know anything about it.
Right.
It kept me in a place of constant learning, and I love to learn. I'm a curious person by nature. Um, but it was the Wild West.
I
I
bet.
didn't really have a whole lot of instruction, and I don't know if your clients are aware, but commercial processors are not regulated,
Right.
right? So you literally could butcher on the back of a pickup truck if it's a hunted animal, and
Hmm.
no one's going to come tell you any different.
Right. Right.
So, so
It's not USDA, so there's
it's
all
not
those
USDA, right?
all those
So,
requirements don't apply. Right.
right. And so it's great in theory, but in practice, we can get to that. Then you have folks that are say processors don't give them their meat, or we talk about batch processing, so there's a lot
Yes.
of pros and
Yes.
cons to that approach.
Yep.
And so I really was, self-taught. I had some mentors here and there of other butchers that would come to work,
Hmm.
that taught me techniques, but really it was just a matter of working, over 1,000 animals a year. You talk about
Wow.
repetition,
Wow.
and repetition and repetition. And, so I stayed there for 7 years, and I started doing hunt camps, started getting more interested in, well, let me backtrack a little bit. So in 2020, right, it's almost like the before 2020 and the after 2020 of the
It is
world,
a
right?
major
Like
milestone. Yes.
yeah, it's a major milestone, I think, that we all share.
I agree.
And so by that point, I had been a butcher about 2 years, right? I
Hmm.
don't even think that at that point I really understood, um, butchery as an art and things like that. I was still pretty new at it. I was still really learning animal parts.
Right.
I was still learning the verbiage of everything else. But what I did know is that it it ignited a sense of purpose in me.
Wow.
Because it made me realize how truly disconnected
Mm,
we are from where our food comes from.
right.
Right. And here I was working and learning this trade where I'm constantly reminded that this is an animal that is going to get turned into food. I could never separate myself
Yep.
from it. And it led me to start thinking about where our food comes from and
Yeah.
how much I didn't know and how much the biases against hunting are not based in fact. You know,
Right.
they're based in Bambi, where they're not hunters, there's poachers, right? There's a
Right.
difference.
Right.
And so I really became very passionate about learning about where my food came from. You know,
Yeah.
it really started like kind of an individual movement within me.
Right.
Um, and I think as an artist by nature, as a storyteller by nature, that sort of bled over to my social media.
Yeah.
And so I started sharing really as I was learning.
Hmm.
You know, I was telling people, okay, this is where fajitas came from, but I
Right.
had probably just learned that like 2 minutes prior. You know, it's
You know,
like I didn't.
I think that a lot of people kind of woke up to that during COVID. You
Yeah,
know, when there were supply chain issues and you saw bare
absolutely.
shelves, and all of a sudden something that we all took for granted, everybody said, "No, where does this come from? Why is there an issue?" And then I think a lot of people coming out of that wanted to be more self-reliant. I think we've got more people into hunting and fishing now because of COVID, which is causing some crowding issues in some places. But I think overall, it has made people more aware of exactly what you're saying. Where does our food come from? What's our relationship to that? And what I appreciate about you, Kriss, is how you put forward, these truths. I think there are good ways and there are better ways to do these things. And the way that I see you do it is from the perspective of you have lived the experience of somebody that's completely unaware of hunting and somebody that's transitioned into it through education and experience. And now you have a different perspective and you share that. And I see you as a great advocate because do I want everybody to be a hunter? No, because the woods would be too crowded and there's not enough, game out there, right? But I
Yeah.
want everybody to understand it. And I want people to understand, my perspective, your perspective,
Hmm.
that we're not evil people trying to hurt animals for our pleasure. It is a
Right.
connection to nature. It is very primal, something that, mankind has done throughout history and often for survival. But, we are at a point now where, okay, do we need to do it? No, but we can still do it for really good reasons and in a very respectful manner, like the way you do it. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. You know, one of the things that became important to me during 2020 was to start kind of sharing that knowledge. You
Hmm.
know, it became important to me that meat eaters reconnect, you know,
Agreed.
especially folks in urban cities, you know,
Yeah.
so I did a couple of pop-ups in Chicago where I did butchery demonstrations and then, you know, we ate the animal.
Hmm.
Um, and really it was just to have these conversations, right? So let's just talk about stewardship of our planet. Let's
Right.
talk about the stewardship of the food that we eat. And, you know, I always just feel that we're so disconnected from the food that we eat, you know, and then we talk about how we are what we eat. And if you
Right.
don't know what you're eating, it's like you're disconnected from yourself, which in
Yep.
turn disconnects you from others, right?
Yeah. No, I
And
agree.
so food is the one thing that we all need and is the one thing that we all have in common.
It is a common connection. Well said.
Yes. And all food requires some death,
Yep.
right? Like all
Yep.
food requires some death.
Yep.
And if we're unwilling to face that, we're going to not be able to deal with any sort of hard situations, right? So I always feel like my work is an invitation to be uncomfortable in a safe place.
Right.
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 And then to sit through that discomfort and realize what it says about your relationship to your food, what it says about your relationship to yourself, to have these conversations. I have had, vegetarians come to my events. I often even say that I have more in common with a vegetarian than I do, with someone who is willfully ignorant of
Right.
where their food comes from,
Right.
doesn't want to know, doesn't care.
Yep.
Because I do believe that if you're eating meat commercially, and we all participate in it, that you should be a steward of the animals that you eat. These
Yeah.
animals, they suffer, and
Yep.
so when you put that up against hunting from a humane, ethical standpoint, and you have one hunter out in the woods, killing one animal to feed their family for 1 year. And that animal has allowed to live as close to a natural life as possible.
Right.
Everything's touched by man, but
Yep. Yep.
has been allowed to thrive and live a life of relative freedom and free roam. It seems to me that that is more ethical in terms of if you're going to eat food, where you should source your meat from,
Right.
as opposed to continuing to contribute to, suffering, sick animals that don't have that. They are not allowed to live their full natural lives. They're not allowed to have that experience.
Yep. Yep.
Animals are emotional creatures,
Right.
and it's it saddens me, right?
Yeah. It's a
That
difficult topic. I mean,
it's yeah.
I come from an agricultural background actually, and was a farmer and rancher before I kind of chose a different career. So I have pretty good awareness around that. And for
Yeah.
those that are listening and maybe thinking, what is Chris talking about? The way that I would describe it is the confined feeding operations. So where
Right.
you've got high densities of animals, often chickens and pigs, with not much space around them. Cattle tend to be, have a lot of space except for the final phase when they're put into feedlots. And there's a balance there, because can we survive without some form of, kind of commercial agriculture? Probably not, with, the billions of people that we have around the world. But I think it's a good voice to bring forward to make sure that we're doing it right, and as humanely as possible. And I guess I'm working on the opposite end of the spectrum. One of my focuses is on hunters who, and I've seen these guys, the guys that went hunting with my dad, and they come to our place in Oklahoma, where when they shot a deer, instead of celebration, it was a letdown. It was like, oh, what am I going to do with this now? And they have this misperception about, well, it's not good, then I'll have to give
Mm-hmm.
it away. And I mean, that's the wild game waste side of things that I'm really working on, So I think you and I are
Yeah.
kind of working at two ends of the spectrum for a common good of education, of
Yeah,
you're
absolutely.
focused on the perspective that you have as a background. And for that, I thank you, because we need advocacy in all areas. And something else I think is cool, I'm a father of two grown daughters. You're focused, I think, a lot on people that don't necessarily look like the majority of hunters and fishermen, and making sure that they
Right.
have that they see somebody and go, Kriss Abigail's doing this. I think I could do it too. I find it interesting, because I
Yeah.
want us to be a welcoming environment, right? So that people want to pick this up and they don't feel like they have to look like they came from, you know, from mid Texas and be a man, right?
Yeah,
And that's where
right.
I really respect the work that you've done, is not only you talking the talk, but you've got the I'll say the chops, is kind of the terminology I would use. You're demonstrating you have skill. I have seen the work that you've done on Instagram, where like you had a boned out neck of a nilgai. And for anybody that has not boned out an animal, to do the neck as well as what I saw Chris do on her Instagram picture is insane, because it's this the processes and the bones of the spine kind of go in and out, in and out, in and out, and you just kind of laid it out there almost like a museum quality bone set. Right? And so,
Thank
it's
you.
just, and that's part of what I want to talk to you about today too,
Hmm.
is, hopefully my audience, I talk a lot about wild game cooking, but one of the things that's really important too is getting to the point where you have the meat in your freezer. And a big part of that is processing. And I've always said I'm very supportive of folks taking their meat to a game processor
Hmm.
if they would feel more comfortable doing that. But there's things they should know about prepping in the field, and
Absolutely.
I think choosing your wild game processor, because not all of them are created equal. I've had some bad experiences early in
Hmm.
my hunting career, is why I do my own now. But then I've seen others like yourself who are consummate professionals and understand kind of the needs of the hunter and the way that you do it. You're not forcing a wild game animal to be butchered like a commercial, cow or pig.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because
Right.
there's a big difference, I'm sure, that you use as well. So if we could switch gears a little bit on,
Hmm.
people that want to bring into a game processor, what are the tips? What's the approach that you would like them to have? And maybe you can use as an example some not so great moments where people have done some things too.
um, well, I think that what I tell people is that there's just like two things. If you're not going to remember anything else, is to remember to keep everything cold and dry,
Yep.
right? Cold and dry is going to be your friend in every scenario.
So
um,
you would not say put them in a ice chest full of water for a week.
I, no, I would
That
say
makes me
please don't do
crazy.
that. I'd say please don't do that. Um, I, there's the way that I actually prefer to get my animals, is I prefer them field dressed,
Yeah.
but hide on, unless you're doing something taxidermy related,
Yeah.
because I will hang them for a few days.
Right.
That's something that we can go into, like aging
Yeah.
venison, like
Will
you
you
would
hang
age
them with the
beef.
hide on, or do you
I
want it
do
because of
hang them with the
cleanliness?
hide on.
Okay, that's good.
I hang them with the hide on because you get a minimal loss.
Yeah.
If you hang them hide off, you'll get the dry rind, which,
Yep.
is just fine,
Right.
but then you'll have to remove that. Unless they're getting something from the hide done for taxidermy, where I do
Okay.
want to get the hide off as soon as possible,
Right.
I will leave them with hide on until I'm ready to butcher. And once I'm ready to butcher, I will skin them out. And
Okay.
so for that maintains the meat loss sort of to the interior
Yeah.
of the animal,
Yep.
maybe a little bit off the hindquarters, in the interior of the rib cage, but
Yep.
otherwise everything else is well protected.
Yeah, I'm
So
very jealous of your situation, because I've seen some of the work that you've done, and you'll cut like a flank
yeah,
or things like that. In my practice, because I'm doing it myself, I have a lot of loss, and those thinner pieces like that, they just don't age well. You know what I mean? Like with no
yeah,
protection.
right, yeah, that's the downside. It
Yep.
is and I guess that's like the difference between what a commercial processor can do and what you
Yep.
can do in
Yep.
your home.
Yeah.
One thing that you touched about that I agree upon is that there is definitely space, for both home butchery and commercial processing. I think that commercial processors have their place. Obviously, it's what, keeps me employed and happy.
Sure.
But I do believe that every hunter should know,
Yeah.
right? Like you should know, you should have that experience. You should give yourself the gift of that labor.
Yep.
And that's really what led me to start doing a lot more education.
Yep.
Um, because the work, a lot of times is I would hear stories from hunters being like, oh, we saved, the back straps and the tenders, and then we left the rest in the woods. Or,
Can you
there's
believe
just,
that? That just
I,
upsets me. Upsets me so much. Yeah.
it's upsetting,
Yeah.
because it's like you went through this trouble, this animal died, give
Yeah.
give the whole carcass a sense of purpose,
Right.
right?
Right.
For me, my butchery, I always say that I'm honoring the hunted first and the hunter second.
I agree.
So I'm doing everything I can to ensure that the end product of this animal represents like the beauty of its life.
Yep.
Uh, and the hunter gets to then benefit and share, right? There's
Sure.
nobody more generous than a hunter, really,
Right.
in that sense of the word.
When you age, how long do you hang? Um,
Oh, well, I would say that at a minimum, 6 days.
okay. Okay.
So
Does
at a
it
minimum for
vary
6 days.
on animal? I mean, for instance, my perception, and I'm not
Mhm.
as experienced as you because you get exposure to so many per year, but my
Yes.
perception is like an antelope, pronghorn antelope, is
Mhm.
extremely tender and probably doesn't require as many days, whereas maybe an older, I don't know, mature mule deer or something like that might take a little while. Do you see that
Yeah.
range, or is that a wise
I
tale?
do. I do. During off season, that gives me a little bit more flexibility in
Hmm.
terms of when I'm aging. So that's when I'll see a lot of those. During hunting season, it's basically, it doesn't matter what animal it is. It gets a standard, like six
Okay.
day, 7 day age,
Yeah.
and then it gets moved through the system. I think that, while aging does affect the tenderization, I think it also concentrates the flavor. So I think that
Hmm.
every animal really benefits from an age. I don't particularly like to butcher an animal before 24 hours.
Oh,
24
I
hours
agree.
is the absolute
That's a
minimum.
minimum. I agree.
Um, and then, but a lot of times, sometimes that's not possible, right? Like
Yeah.
if it's a hot day, there's
Temperature.
nowhere to hang it. You
Yep.
gotta, you gotta get broken down and you gotta get it put up.
Yep.
So the one thing that I tell folks is that in that instance, if you've got your animal quartered, you're not taking it to a processor. You may could consider like a standing fridge or somewhere where you can age
Yep.
the whole quarters yourself.
Yep. I've done
And
that
then,
actually. We kind of have a drink fridge, and my wife, thank
hmm
goodness, is forgiving enough that she allows me to remove everything, and I
yeah,
put an entire bull elk, a 5 point, in a
that's,
refrigerator. It just
oh, that's so
barely
cool.
fit.
Yeah.
Now, when it got done, I did have to painstakingly clean that dude out, the refrigerator, because she's
Yeah.
like, we are not putting the soda back in there with all that ooze. but but like you said, it can be done, right? You can age.
Yes.
That's the only way that I can really age because I don't have like a walk-in. If I think there's a meme going around that if I win the lottery, you won't know it, but you'll see the signs. Well, that would be one of them. Is I'd have a walk-in fridge,
Right. Me too. Me
cooler.
too.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
no, no. So folks, I definitely believe it's fantastic to come to a processor. Even though I do my own, I would be happy to take it to a processor. Like if I'm traveling, I don't have time, or I can't get it cool. Because my first concern is the meat itself, and
Right.
to make sure that it's preserved right. And
Right.
sometimes I don't have time. But for those of us that do have time, what advice do you have? And I'll start with, because I know that you do, and I really respect these clinics that you put on at the
hmm
San Antonio Food Bank. That's a really neat program. I desperately wanted to get to that one you had in February, but I couldn't make it work out. So maybe next time.
Yeah.
But how do you go about running those clinics and teaching people to be able to break down their own animal?
Oh, I'm so grateful to the San Antonio Food Bank and to Casa Venada for allowing me to come and teach the clinics because I'll teach at hunt camps, and I definitely like to get knives in people's hands. I carry
Right.
extra knives with me.
Right.
It's like I do this all day, every day, so I want you to do it with me. But the one thing that is lacking from hunt camps is repetition.
That's
And
true.
repetition is really what's going to get you to hone that skill.
Yep.
And so what the clinics at the food bank do is that they allow me to meet two goals where I can give people repetition,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we will spend, some time learning how to skin. I'll do a whole clinic where I'm the one that's breaking down the animal.
Mm-hmm.
We'll break for lunch. And then when we come back in the afternoon, it's like, okay, now you're going to be skinning and now you're going to be working this part of the animal. And even if it's you get to work a shoulder and a hindquarter, I mean, you walk away with that muscle memory, right?
Yep.
It's really about giving people some opportunity to develop muscle memory.
Yep.
Uh, is the best the best way to like hone your skill, the best way to start feeling comfortable. I often tell people when they're coming to train with me for season that for it takes about a month, I think, until you start feeling comfortable without asking for my name every 5 minutes or a question. Like start to be able to answer your own questions.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I think it's a deceptively simple skill, but I also think it's less intimidating than it looks.
I agree.
I think that once people get a knife in their hand and they start kind of navigating it, I try to get people to feel free to like fuck up and not to feel like they have to
Exactly.
do the cuts perfect. Like it's like
Yep.
forget that I've done my 10,000 hours of these cuts, right?
That's just it. Is you get so much
Yeah.
exposure and repetition. And it's like, and
Yeah.
I've been doing this. I'm 52, and I've been doing this. I've been butchering my own deer probably for 30 years. And even I get lost sometimes. It's like every time I go to cut that hind quarter at the ball socket, I'm always like, oh, I didn't do that as well as I should have, or to try to do the neck, or it's just
Yeah.
like, damn it, I've been doing this long enough, but I do, 3 animals maybe a year, and for you, that's a lot of big game animals. But like
That
you
is a
get,
lot.
1,000 in a year is just crazy, and I can imagine you
Yeah.
become really proficient. But
Yeah.
that is a fantastic clinic. How many animals do people get to work on? They get to work on like a piece or a part. Maybe they do a shoulder or a
They
leg or a
get to
couple of
work
them.
yeah, it really depends on what the food bank has
Okay.
available. But I would say that typically we work about 4 animals within a day.
Okay.
So, for a class about 6 to 8 students, so there's a
Yep.
lot of, I try to make sure that everyone gets a piece to work.
That's
I
cool.
try, and my goal is to especially get folks to work difficult things like the neck,
Yeah.
to work the muscles of the hindquarters. Back straps and tenders, they take a little bit of work, but they're a little bit more accessible
Yep.
in terms of removing them,
Yeah.
regardless of skill level.
Yep.
But things like the neck, the shoulders, stuff like that, I tried to definitely get folks practicing on those.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, before we leave the food bank, can you tell folks a little bit about that food bank and the application that they have? Where I think they have a processing kind of part that's dedicated to deer, isn't it? Which is
Yes.
a really cool
So
program that I've not seen everywhere.
yeah, it doesn't exist
Right.
really. So it's my understanding that the San Antonio Food Bank, they have the only on-site wild game processing site at a food bank in the country.
I think that's
It's
right.
called
Yeah.
Casa Venado, and it's a beautiful facility. And what it does is that, and actually, let's assume that folks don't know about Hunters for the Hungry.
Yep.
So
That's a
Hunters for
good
the
one too.
Hungry is an organization nationwide where hunters can donate their kill, their take, to a processor, which in turn will process it into ground venison, send it to the food bank, and the food bank then distributes it to the community.
Right.
It's a really fantastic way for hunters to give back to the community. If you have extra tags, you
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily, your freezer's full, and you want to do something good for the community, it's a great way to give back.
Yep.
And so what the San Antonio Food Bank has done is that they have essentially removed the need for a lot of commercial processors. So
Mm-hmm.
now hunters can directly donate uh, their hunts to the food bank. The food bank then trains volunteers to process it. It all gets turned into ground venison. There's no
Mm-hmm.
bespoke butchery happening, um, which is also great for teaching classes,
Yep.
because then it doesn't matter
Oh, that's right. If you mess it up, no big
if you
deal.
mess it up because it's going to go into the grinder anyway.
Interesting. I didn't realize that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
And
people listening might not fully understand too. They might be like, "Well, why would somebody go shoot an animal and donate it?" Well, I think in a lot of places they have high populations of white-tailed
Hmm.
deer, especially.
Yes.
Often there are tags issued for kind of culling from a perspective of an
Right.
overpopulation, especially of does. And so that may
Right.
be it. Or it may be a situation where, like you're saying, the person is thoughtful and does, keep their game, but they have an extra tag and they want to give back. So I think,
Yeah.
that is a good approach, and it's a good outlet. And I would rather that than them put it in a freezer, store it for a year, and throw it away. That's
Yeah,
my nightmare
absolutely.
scenario.
Well, and I think that programs like Hunters for the Hungry, programs like the San Antonio Food Bank, having Casa Venado, are
Hmm.
really important in rewriting the narrative around hunting,
Yeah, agreed.
right?
Yeah,
Where hunting is barbaric and uneducated, and the folks who are doing it just want to, like you said, just looking out to kill and,
yeah,
trophy this and trophy that, and
yeah.
all
Only
these
about
and all these
score and things like
tropes.
that. Yeah, no.
Yeah, and all these tropes about what hunting is, when in actuality, once you immerse yourself in the world, it's very welcoming. And, that's one of the things that I'd like to touch upon, is where we're talking about how I don't look like someone that would necessarily occupy that space that I,
Hmm.
that I do.
Hmm.
Um, and so I just want people to understand that in actuality, the outdoors world is very diverse, and it's very open, and it's very welcoming, for the express purpose that we all share the goal of preserving our wild spaces, right?
Yeah,
The, what is it, that the ground is our common ground, right?
right,
So
right.
whatever differences that we may have, it disappears when you're out in nature, right?
Yeah,
There's a commonality there. There's a connection there. And so folks who feel like, oh, well, it's very male dominated, and it's all this and it's all that. I understand, but that's just what you see on the surface,
right.
right? Once you actually go into the world, you'll see that there's tons of people, tons of organizations. We talk about Hunters of Color. There's a bunch
Yep,
of women-led organizations.
yep,
I work with The Way We Hunt, that does a lot of veteran driven, female veterans. You've got a
yep.
lot of women guides. There's so much room
Right.
that there's no need to feel like you don't belong. It's
Yeah.
the one thing that nature does is affirm to you that that is where you belong, because we are
Right.
nature, right? We
Right.
are
Right.
a part of it.
Yep.
That's the one beautiful thing about hunting, that I feel that I love to see this experience in new hunters.
Yep.
When you
I
see that
agree.
they have that moment of connection to the cycle of nature,
Yeah, I feel it's
you
very
know?
human, right?
Yeah,
It's an experience, a
yeah,
human experience that I think everybody should be, if not participate in, be aware of,
yeah.
and just it's a bit of inclusion, and so that sounds weird coming from a person that's kind of a majority representative, but I really do feel like people. I don't, like I said, I don't want everybody to be a hunter, but I want everybody to
Yeah,
respect my choice to hunt. But I have a responsibility to do it in a respectful manner. And there are some on the
absolutely.
fringe that don't do that. And I find it, I think it's our responsibility to try to, police is the wrong word, but to try to help them understand,
Well,
the implications of what they're doing and why.
yeah, I think mentorship goes a long way towards that,
I agree. Well said.
programs like, backcountry hunters and anglers,
Yep.
programs like the Texas Wildlife Association.
Yeah.
There are tons of programs out there, uh, directed towards new hunters for
Yep.
the purpose of creating more conservation minded,
Yep.
more ethically minded hunters, which I think is fantastic, in the direction that we all need to continually
Yep.
go in, right? That's not everybody needs to be a hunter. Not everyone wants to be a hunter, and
No.
that's okay. Not
Yep.
everyone wants to be a gardener. Not,
Right.
my husband's the gardener. I can't, I don't garden, but I can hunt.
For, for folks that are on audio only podcasts, Kriss wins the award for the best background. She's sitting in. You may have noticed some bird sounds. Those are not like that's something that I'm overlaying on this. She is sitting in the middle of a beautiful garden. There are, insects buzzing by and the wind is swaying. She's got beautiful flowers behind her. So one of the best backgrounds
Oh,
of
thank
anybody
you.
I've ever
Yeah,
talked to.
it's my living room.
So Kriss,
We live
well,
in a tiny home and there's no room for anything in
but you
there.
have the outside and you have a beautiful place. I enjoy the
Yeah,
pictures you put on Instagram.
thank you.
So I
Thank
do
you.
want to talk a little bit about, kind of things that you would advise people that want to be better home butchers. And
Hmm.
maybe we kind of walk a little bit through that. Maybe we start with kind of equipment. I think it's pretty simple, but what do you think is the base set of equipment of people ought to have and how they maintain that?
Well, one thing that I talk to a lot of people about at my hunt camps is that my specific style of butchering, because that's how I've learned, is bench butchering. It's
Mm-hmm.
on a table.
Mm.
And the experience that a lot of hunters have is doing it hanging. And so in times of when you're hanging it, you're using gravity, you're using all these things that don't necessarily allow you to take the time. Right. So I would say that the first thing you do is you get yourself a table. A nice height. Got to remember about your back because you're going to be kind of bent over.
Yeah.
And some cutting boards and really a nice knife set. It doesn't have to be super expensive, custom made. I've been really using Victorinox. Their
Those are good.
ranges, yeah, they're like 25 to $50 on the high end,
Yep.
and they're workhorses.
Right.
They're absolute workhorses. So those are the things that I would say.
Mm-hmm.
That you really want to start out with, to set yourself up for success, and then understand that it's going to take a long time, right? So
Yes.
don't think, okay, I'm going to go run errands in the morning and then I'm going to butcher in the afternoon.
No. No. Well
It's like,
said.
I'm a professional butcher and even I'm like, okay, it's going to take me like an hour to do this animal all the way through.
Yeah.
And I have to plan for my day for that, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
I would say to block out yourself half a day at the
At
least.
least. And I would say
At
that's for
least.
probably a whitetail. If you got an elk, you
Yeah.
better have
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. You better have a couple of days,
Yeah.
because then you're talking about the, product making, not even just like the butchering of it.
Yep.
And then you're making products. So really, one of the things that I talk a lot about when we're going to hunt camps and we're just having these conversations is how we do a lot of prep work up until the hunt,
Okay.
right? We make sure we have all our gear. I always see you like working out and
Mm-hmm.
prepping for your hunts, which I
Yep.
like always super admire. I'm like,
Well,
yes,
thanks.
that's the way to do it. I'm not gonna do it, but he's doing it for us. um, but like all that work that you do leading up to the hunt,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you have your day of the hunt and either you're hiking out or you're doing something before the sun is up, before, everybody starts waking up.
Mm-hmm.
In Texas, you're normally going out to a blind or, maybe you're spot and stock. Like there's just so much work
Yeah.
leading up to the hunt. And then you have to hunt, right? Like, and then if you are fortunate enough and nature has allowed you to, you have an animal at your disposal, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then but then that's when the work starts. It's like all the work that you do leading up to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's like the fun stuff,
I agree.
And then the minute that animal goes down, that's when the work begins. So you have to give yourself like twice as much time to do the work
Yep.
if you're butchering at home, than you think you need to,
Yep.
right? Like give yourself that gift of that time. That way you don't get frustrated, you don't get discouraged.
Right.
You can look up YouTube videos, you can like find me on Instagram and feel free
There's a
to like
lot
send me questions,
of resources.
lot of resources on,
Yep.
and just to like set yourself up for success on that way, right?
Yeah.
Like make yourself a plan. I make myself a plan of like when I'm going to butcher what and what I'm going to do
Yep.
just so that it all goes nice and smooth.
Yeah. No, that was
Yeah.
well said. I mean, just like you're saying, part of my prep is actually even for my coolers, I don't put ice in contact with the meat. I freeze
Right.
water jugs so that I can minimize. There's still some condensation, but so I can minimize the amount of water that gets in contact with meat. And so that's a process because I don't want to go
Yeah.
buy jugs. I take, gallon jugs of water, freeze them over the course of weeks, put them in a
Yeah.
cooler, take them to where I'm hunting, and then hopefully you're successful and you put the meat in there. So just even that is a huge amount of prep, and it buys you time so that you
Right.
don't have to, hurry. You have confidence. I know that meat's going to be cold, and you cover
Hmm.
it up. I'm saying I put a blanket or something over the cooler, keep it out of the sun, and you've got time to get it to hopefully a fridge or something where you can age it, or if 24 hours elapse, you can go ahead and start butchering. But
Right.
so on cuts, I'm interested. Something that I've seen myself do over the course of my hunting career was at first kind of like the food bank. Everything was ground because I didn't really
Hmm.
know much. Steaks and some ground. And as I think I've had a journey to try to learn things to cook, I have started to leave more things whole. Like I love to have the shoulder blade and the arm roast, the blade
Hmm.
roast and the arm roast whole. I take whole roasts out of at least one hind quarter, and maybe grind some of the meat on the other. What do you find for yourself or maybe for your customers? What's the approach that you've seen that seems to be a nirvana, or is it really just kind of bespoke to the person on how they utilize it?
A little bit of both. I think
Yeah.
that so my approach from like a commercial processor is that it's very bespoke.
Yeah.
It's very much one of my favorite things to do, and uh, is to have a discussion with a hunter and let's talk about like what you eat.
Nice.
Especially like a newer hunter,
Yeah.
or maybe even one that's been processing for a long time and is now bringing it to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, what do you like to eat? And we talk about flavor profiles, and we talk about, thickness of cuts of steak, or we
Yeah.
talk about jerky. We have a whole conversation based around it. Because in that medium, my goal is to definitely provide the best experience, and the best product from
Mm-hmm.
both the animal and for the hunter. And the same goes when, we go to hunt camps and we're talking to a lot of people about home butchery, right?
Right.
And when you're talking about home butchery, I do prefer whole cuts. I wholeheartedly agree with you on that. I believe that roasts are great. One of the things that I advise folks to do is like, listen, you can slow cook a whole shoulder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Minimal, like good, just salt and pepper slices,
Yep.
slow cook it.
Yep.
And then you have pulled meat that you can then portion out,
Yep.
right? You can portion it out.
Exactly.
And then you just have on deck like shredded meat that you can further season,
Yep.
however, whatever flavor profile you have.
Yep.
And that's one of the ways that I try to break down how intimidating it can be to do home processing, because then folks are thinking about, well, I don't have a grinder.
Right.
I don't have a stuffer.
Right.
It's like, okay, what am I going to do with this animal? I have to
Mm-hmm.
get the whole meat off. What do I do with the meat afterwards?
Yeah.
For me, it's like, listen, if you don't have a grinder, just throw it in the slow cooker.
Yep.
Slow cook it. So you have a whole deer that's like pulled meat. I mean, it's delicious,
Yeah.
right? It works just as well.
Yep.
I think, demystifying that you need a whole home butchery setup in
Mm-hmm.
order to be able to reap the benefits of your hunt, that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
And then talking about not all processors are created equal. One of the things that I would tell your audience is to ask, right? So there are two types of processing if you're not familiar. One is called batch and one is called individual.
Okay.
And in batch processing, what they will do is that they will take your animal and they will ask you what you want. Now, if you want steak cuts, it is likely that that will come from your animal.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you want summer sausage or any other product, what happens is that they will butcher all animals across the board together,
Mm-hmm.
make product, and then divvy it out among however many
Sure.
hunters in that.
Sure.
So then you're not getting back
Yep.
your own venison,
Yeah.
your own wild game. You're getting a batch product of everyone's wild game.
Yeah. That's well
And
explained,
so,
and something that not everybody tells you when you go to them.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, let's to make more informed hunters out there is to ask those questions. You want someone that does individual processing and is able to sort of back that up, whether in reputation or in conversation. I think you can very quickly discern, if you bring in a white-tailed doe and they're like, oh, you want 50 pounds of summer sausage?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, no, you're not getting 50 pounds of summer sausage off a white-tailed doe,
Right. Right.
you know? And so things like that will help, I think, rebuild the trust that
Yeah.
hunters have with processors.
Yeah.
Because there is those instances where even if, like you yourself, a proficient at-home butcher, sometimes maybe you don't have the time or
Agreed.
you don't have the desire
Right.
or, you have a Kriss Abigail who makes great sausages and
Right.
so you want to bring her some meat. So
Yeah.
there's a space where those two things coexist. I
Completely
don't
agree.
ever think about sometimes I'll get asked, oh, well, do you think about teaching hunters how to butcher their own? Does that cut into them bringing it to you? And I said, no. I think if anything, hunters are like, oh, this is hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. I
I
agree.
might just take my next one to a processor,
Yeah.
So to
Especially if you
be,
want some of those end products too, the sausages
yeah,
and things like that. I've kind
yeah,
of dabbled in it. That's not easy, and
no,
and you need better equipment. And I think I can get there, but like
yeah,
like places like you work, you've got decades of experience. People,
yeah,
not you necessarily, but others,
yeah,
decades of experience of doing that and doing it well. And
yeah.
sometimes you're like, I really don't want to sacrifice 5 years worth of bad sausage to get me there, right?
Absolutely, at 100%. I have a sausage maker,
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
think about if you're thinking about doing it all at home by yourself, understand that even as a professional butcher, I have someone that
Yep.
makes our
They're focused
sausages
on just that. That's
that is
crazy,
just
man.
focused
Yep.
on making beautiful sausage.
Yep.
And I can make sausage, but I cannot make sausage like hers,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
She can make sausage, but she can't butcher with my proficiency, right? So
Right. Right.
there is that overlap.
Yep.
And so a good sausage maker is hard to come by. And
Yeah,
you're
I
right
agree.
that it does require years of experience. We actually, me and my sausage maker, we went to sausage school last summer.
Really?
Yeah, there's a friend of mine named Bill Dumas. He runs a sausage school and he's called the Sausage Sensei. And he will, take you from production from A to Z. And
Nice.
so even if we had been making sausages for a couple of years,
Mm-hmm.
going and furthering our education in
Yeah.
that completely upped our game to
Wow.
now where we're able to play with recipes a lot more.
Yep.
Where,
Yep.
sausage is its own.
It is. I
That's its
agree.
own art form,
Good
its
sausages. Yeah.
own medium. Yeah, good sausage, that's
Yeah.
the only kind of sausage we want to talk about.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
What kind of a selfish request and something I'm
Mhm.
embarrassed to say that I do on a regular basis, but I seem to not be able to not cut myself at least once during a butchering session. And I've got a friend who used to always whisper in my ear. He'd be like, "Cut away, cut away." Do you have any advice for people who are prone to do things like that when they're doing their home butchering?
Um, so I definitely I don't subscribe to the cutaway as I cut towards myself all the time.
Okay, you're making me feel better.
Again, it's I'm self-taught. Yeah,
Yeah.
here's what I would say. This is what I do is I should have brought a knife out, but if I've got my knife, I
Mm-hmm.
will put my finger on the back of the blade.
Okay.
Okay. And that's one way that I always kind of know directionally where my
Yeah.
blade is going,
Right.
so that I always have my finger is there. It's not
That's
at
a
the
good
tip of the
idea.
blade, it's just on the back of it.
Yep.
Because if you're holding it like this,
Yeah.
then you're not really feeling the pressure
Yep.
You're feeling the pressure from the back end, but if you have your finger on your knife here, you can feel the whole thing
That's a good tip.
where it's moving.
Yep.
So that's something that I always try to teach in my class. If you are removing silver skin,
Mm-hmm.
I always tell folks to make their non-knife hand, right? So you've got your knife hand and you've got your non-knife hand. And you want to
Yep.
take your non-knife hand and you kind of want to make a little bowl out of your top
Yeah.
so that when you're coming through with your knife, you want your knife to be tilted up. And what this does is it keeps your fingers clear of your
Okay.
knife as it's coming and scraping up.
Yep.
Right? So you don't even have to look at your knife. You can have, you're removing the silver skin off the back strap.
Mm-hmm.
I can have this hand here, my knife here. I don't have to even be looking at my knife because my fingers are protected. I
Okay.
can just follow that line up and out.
That's a really good tip.
Yeah. So, little things like that. I mean, I will still on occasion, I will still on occasion nick myself here and there.
Yeah.
But definitely, I will tell you that definitely in my first couple of years,
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of shaved knuckles.
Yep.
There's like chunks of my fingers missing.
Yep. Yep. It
It's just,
happens. Yeah.
it just happens. A sacrifice to the meat gods.
Well, any advice? I would imagine you're probably a stickler on keeping your knives sharp, and so for those of us that are kind of not professionals at that, anything special you do in that area?
I always say that a sharp knife is a knife in use, right? So, so use your knife.
Yep.
Practice with it. But really, I would say that the best that you can do is obviously after you wash it, don't put it away wet. That'll start dulling the blade. Make sure
Yep.
it's nice and dry.
Yep.
The other thing you can do is find yourself a really good guided knife sharpener.
Agreed.
I use a combination of a whetstone
Mm-hmm.
and a diamond honing steel. If you can
Okay.
find yourself a diamond steel,
Yep.
those are by far some of the best, I think.
Mm-hmm.
They're made by a lot of different brands. But a quality steel is always good. And then if you can Worksharp makes these really great sharpening devices that have guides on them.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're sharpening a butcher knife, you're looking for at about a 25-degree angle.
Okay.
And so the work sharps, they will often come with angle guides.
Right.
And so those angle guides are really great. I still use them.
Yeah. It's all about consistency,
It's
on that every
all about
stroke.
consistency. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all about
Yeah.
consistency. You want to do the same side on one blade. You want to do it to the other side.
Yeah.
You just want to take your time with it. I will sit and, every once in a while just resharpen my knives, especially before season
Yep.
and then after season. But they don't really ever get put up. So they're always constantly in work. And so I'm like, how do I keep a knife sharp? Just keep cutting because you're going to have to keep sharpening it,
It is a process.
Yeah,
Sure.
it is. It is a process, sharpening a knife is one of those other things that it's a skill set in itself. I think it took me about 3 to 4 years, really.
Mm-hmm.
You're starting from ground zero, to feel comfortable enough to consistently be able to sharpen my knife. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, all of this is I think some of the key messages I take away from a lot of this discussion is that even a professional such as yourself, you had to start kind of at ground zero. You took
Yeah.
time, repetition, learning from others, but not being afraid to fail and continuing to, learn and grow. And, I mean, you've been doing this, what now, 8, 9 years?
Yeah, I've been doing it 8 years now.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so, I would encourage folks to look at your Instagram and see some of your work and be like, wow, that is really precision. I mean, if somebody, like I said, is somebody has done a pelvis, I think you've got a pelvis that you did on an animal or a neck. And
Yeah.
those are some serious skills. So my compliments to you on that.
Thank you.
I want to switch gears before we run out of time and talk a little bit about your hunting experience. And I think I said at the beginning that, I first was kind of introduced to you or aware of you from a BHA event that you came to, and you won a raffle, you won a rifle. and
Yes.
there was a bit of confusion because I'm part of the staff and I'm on the board for Texas, and somebody said, who was it that won the rifle? And somebody else said, I don't know, but there's this woman walking around with one that has this huge smile, and we have to tell her that she can't take it home tonight because we have to go to an FFL, which is, is the
Yeah,
process,
yeah.
and nobody wanted to tell you can't take it home tonight, you know.
I would have walked right out with it.
But I have rarely seen somebody so excited. You were just so excited that night. And then I think it's just after that through Instagram that I became
Yeah.
aware of you and the work that you're doing and all of that, which really kind of, led to me. I think I introduced myself at the last BHA
Yeah.
event because I was like, this person's got a cool Instagram. I need to go and say hello. So I hope you don't mind that I probably interrupted
No,
your
no, that was
conversation.
fantastic. That was
So,
fantastic.
and then as I started this podcast, I was like, you're the kind of people that I want to talk to, meaning, you're proficient, but also an educator of your skill, and you have a mission out there as well to help people do things better in
Absolutely.
this space. So, but
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about your own hunting experience. So, I know now you've kind of started. Most people start hunting and then go into butchery. You started butchery and then got into
Hmm.
hunting as a progression. And I know we could go on for probably another hour about that, but where are you now in your hunting journey and your perspective on all of that? I mean, I know that, you kind of came to understand hunting through your butchering, but to go out and do it yourself is a little bit different.
It was extremely different. It was extremely different. It took, many years. I first had to reconcile the fact that this was an animal,
Right.
right? And then it sort of built to like this was the hunter.
Right.
And as I started, seeing the way different animals were shot,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very intimate relationship a butcher has with, especially a hunted animal.
Yeah.
Um, it was very intimidating to me.
Mm-hmm.
I was afraid of, the quote unquote bad shot, which I
Right.
know now,
All
right,
of us worry
happens.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I didn't feel educated enough, I didn't even immersed in the wild game butchery world. I had no idea how to start hunting. I
Hmm.
had none.
Hmm.
I didn't know where to go or what to do. I started following sort of Instagram accounts,
Yeah.
but even then I didn't know. But I did know that I wanted to take that next step, that I needed to take the next step. And the one thing that I could do was in San Antonio, there is a on-site processor where you can go and choose your lamb, choose your sheep, choose your
Okay.
goat, and they do a halal slaughter on site and process it for you there.
Wow. Okay.
And I did that as like a pregame to hunting because
Okay.
I wanted to know what it felt like to be
Right.
responsible for the death of my food.
Right.
I felt that was my next step. That was a connection that I needed. And even that was difficult.
Sure.
Uh, as
In
it
some
should
ways,
be.
I think that is even what you did was probably even more difficult than probably hunting. So,
Yeah, but it should be, right? Like
yeah,
I
agreed.
respect that it should be. I respect that it's bittersweet in that way. Um, and so I had an opportunity, like maybe a few months after that, uh, to go on my first hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And it just so happened to be an aoudad hunt, right? I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't even start out with a whitetail. It was like, let's go aoudad. And, I went with some girlfriends of mine, so it
Mm-hmm.
was an all girls, it was all female. I felt
Cool.
very, empowered and sort of
Right.
supported by that. They're all experienced hunters.
Mm-hmm.
We went out to Mason, Texas to a ranch run by Operation Orphans, which is an incredible organization that takes foster kids out on their first
Nice.
hunt.
Very
So I
cool.
volunteer with them, so like that first experience hunting was pivotal in so many ways,
Right.
really, in changing the course of my life. Um, and I went out and I had that experience that I don't know I could describe. If you're a hunter and you're listening or you're watching, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right?
Yep. Yep.
That that moment when nature wakes up
Yeah.
and you get to be an observer,
Yeah.
you know, and you get to just watch. And then I always say that you're like in a place of asking,
Yeah.
right? If there comes a moment where you're able to get a good clean shot,
Right.
you know?
Yeah.
But that almost feels like secondary
Hmm.
to what is happening around you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember my guy Brian, who is still a friend of mine to this day, uh, him telling me, audads are hardy
Right.
creatures. So, we have to make sure that you got to try to take the best shot you can because she may run off in the
Hmm.
brush. And I did a double lung hard shot.
Nice.
So she went down immediately.
Yep. That's a good
And
feeling when you see that happen.
that was, yeah, I felt such intense sadness
Hmm.
and gratitude
Hmm.
and like accomplishment
Yep.
at the same
All
time.
wrapped together. Yep.
It was all wrapped together. It was the most intense emotional experience I think I had had in a really long time.
Yep.
I never had one quite like it.
Yep. Yeah.
And that really changed my viewpoint on where I wanted my career to go, what I wanted to do. I was like, okay, it really solidified my idea of taking my family off of like grocery store meat. It was like,
Hmm.
okay, I can do this. I can feed my family.
Hmm.
I feel very empowered by it. And sort of, just followed that path,
Yeah.
and I ended up at the BAHA meeting,
Yeah.
conservation conversation
Yeah. It's a tongue twister.
meal. I know it is a tongue twister. Just by like the generosity of my good friend, I had seen
Hmm.
it on Instagram,
Hmm.
and I had been, like I said, I had been looking. I was
Hmm.
like, how do I like expand on this feeling that I had on this hunt? How
Hmm.
do I get into this world more? This is where I
Yep.
want to be.
Right.
I want to have these experiences somehow. How do I get there?
Hmm.
Um, and so I'd seen it on Instagram and I had sent her a thing. I said, oh man, it'd be cool to go to that, but it wasn't within my budget to
Right.
get the tickets.
Yep.
And so she ended up getting us tickets.
Nice.
And so she's the whole reason I went,
That's great.
So
And then you come
I
home with a
went,
rifle too.
yeah, I went, and, I went home with a rifle that I had no idea how to use, it was just like, I was like, oh my God, this is great. And they're like, it's a 22. And I was like, I don't know what that means, but this is great. I will figure out what that
Yep.
means,
Yep. Yep.
And that was, I met Jesse that night
Yep.
and, he offered me to come be at the new School of Traditional Cookery for a season.
That was the door there, really. That is so
that was,
cool.
yeah. And there I got to meet Matt Hughes and Kristen
Yep.
Parma of the Texas Wildlife Association. They
Yep.
run the Adult Learn to Hunt program.
Yep.
And the minute I met Kristen Parma, I mean, it was like, I want to do everything else in my life with this woman all the time.
Right.
So, her and Matt gave me a lot of opportunities within the Texas Wildlife Association to start
Very cool.
going on hunt camps. And on those hunt camps, which are strictly educational camps,
Hmm.
is really like my passion. I found it.
Yep.
I didn't need to ever be at a hunt if I could be at a hunt camp with new hunters.
Yep.
It was that same enthusiasm, that same sense of empowerment, that same adrenaline rush that you kind of like become a junkie for. It had nothing really even to do with the kill. It's like icing if they brought something back to the processing shed.
Yep.
But let's talk about like what your experience was like. What did you see? What did you do? What was it like? What did you hear?
Yeah.
Those are the parts that really sort of fueled me. And then the education aspect of it, right? Like, it's like, I felt I had found a place where I belonged. It's like, here's something that I can contribute
Hmm.
that will only do better for other people, will only
Yep.
make me a better butcher. I
Yep.
believe that like you want to get good at something, you teach it,
Agreed.
right? That's how you really get good at something.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so then from the Texas Wildlife Association, I started doing with other hunt camps. I do hunt camps with the way we hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And I
And
really love the way they run their hunt camps. Yeah, if
yep.
y'all don't know them, look them up on
Yeah.
Instagram. They really run fantastic educational camps, and their camps tend to bring more experienced hunters like yourself,
Hmm.
which is awesome
Hmm.
because there's no bigger compliment for me to receive than for a hunter to be like, Kriss Abigail, you can teach an old dog new tricks, so
I wanted to come to your clinic, not because I
yeah,
don't know how to do it, but I was like, I
yeah,
guarantee there's a skill, there's something that I'm going to learn from you because I don't
yeah,
know it all. And I have my own practices, but I'm self-taught, or maybe I learned from some YouTubes. And
yeah,
like you said, you do 1,000 animals a year. I
yeah.
guarantee there's things I could walk away from that clinic and go, you taught me something there, and I'm going to start using
Right.
that.
Yeah, and with experienced hunters, it's fun in that way.
Yeah, that's
It's
cool.
fun in that way because it's then the questions become about like specific instances. Okay,
Yep.
well, I'm out in the field. How do I do this? Or
Yep.
I like yourself. I love to watch your cooking podcast because
Thank you.
your approach to cooking the wild game is great. It's so diverse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of experienced hunters that come in and they're like, hey, I've like read Hank Shaw's book, or I've been listening to this podcast, and I was really interested, in neck roast and like all these different cuts that I didn't know existed
Mm-hmm.
on these animals because my grandfather was just like, grind it up, boy,
Yep.
you know?
Yep. Yep.
And so there's this whole new wave, I think, this whole new enthusiasm in experienced hunters in wanting to up their wild game cooking
Absolutely.
skills. And so that to me is a whole other aspect that's just as exciting as working with new hunters, right?
I agree.
It's a different language, a different vocabulary, but that same reigniting of enthusiasm for hunting, for the culinary world, for conservation, it's
Yep.
all good.
Yeah, it's a big
Yeah.
universe out there, and I thoroughly
Yeah.
enjoy it, and I know you are as well. I think we could probably talk for another 2 hours, but I want to be
Sure.
respectful of your time. I really appreciate that you setting aside this time to talk with me, Kriss.
Absolutely.
And you have a lot on your plate, so I would like if we could kind of finish up with you telling kind of what's coming up on your calendar, and also what if people want to learn from you, your Instagram. What are the opportunities? Any recommendations you'd make as we work towards closing out?
Sure. So right now I'm in off season,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm still doing some hunt camps. I'll be going up to Jacksboro, Texas again to work with the way we hunt.
Nice.
I'm doing an all ladies hunt, which I think there might be still a couple of seats for, um, with a female ranch manager guide, Cameron Malnar. She's fantastic. And so that'll be an interesting like ladies hunt. It's going to be hunting and mimosas. And then also, for the Texas Wildlife Association, we're starting to rev up for next year's Adult
Mm,
Learn to Hunt Camp. So Kristen Parma and I will be out in Mason at the end of June.
great.
And so right now, we're kind of in a steady gearing up for next season. I'm hoping to be teaching some more clinics at the San Antonio Food Bank. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have dates for that yet. We'll probably get to that closer towards the end of summer.
Yep.
Um, but otherwise, I always tell people have knives will travel,
Yep.
right? Like
Yep.
I'm really passionate about teaching folks. Folks can reach out on my Instagram. It's Kriss_Abigail. My website is meetyourmeat.net. Feel free to like reach out if you have questions or if you want to collaborate or if you have like some crazy idea that you want to float past me.
Mm-hmm.
Come on through. I'm really passionate about sharing the knowledge. I think like I'm an open door in that way. I think that knowledge is meant to be given away. So
Agreed. Agreed.
Yeah.
And I would highly recommend your Instagram to anybody, even if they're not like that focused on learning butchering, because it's really your life journey. And it
Yeah.
makes me smile every day. I'll look at your story or
Oh,
something like that. I'm
thank
like,
you.
that's funny. And I think there's some things, like I'm a bit of an introvert, and I think it looks like you are too, from a perspective
Yeah.
of some of the things you put down there. And I'm like, I identify with what you're saying there. So
Yeah.
I really enjoy it. And, that's what Instagram ought to be, is inspiration, make you smile and make connections, like this. So,
Yeah,
Kriss,
absolutely.
I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I really appreciate how your enthusiasm, just, for folks listening, I reached out to Kriss, on Instagram, direct messages, and said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing this?" And she said, "I would love that," and that's the kind of enthusiasm that I really appreciate, and
Absolutely.
then, was very generous with your time. It's a weekend. And you could be spending this with your family, or out doing things you love, and you've dedicated an hour to sit down with me and talk about the things that you love to do. So thank you so much, Kriss. Thank you for your
Well,
time, and I hope
thank
people
you.
seek you out and really see the talented person that you are.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. I had such a wonderful time, and I just want to say that I'm really glad you're doing this podcast. I was really
Thank you.
excited to see it. I follow along on your Instagram as well.
Thank you.
I think that you are a great advocate. You're accessible. You're very authentic. I think it's great for people to be able to relate to someone like you. And so you're out there. We're just out there doing the work. And I really appreciate having a peer like you out in the
Well,
outdoors
thank you.
world. Yeah.
You don't realize how much I really appreciate that. That touches my heart. And sometimes I think I'm just kind of speaking out into the void, and the only person that hears this is my mom. Because and my mom and dad listen, and they keep score of who I reference. Because like my dad, he said, "Oh, you didn't talk about your mom, but you talked about me." So they're sitting at home, kind of like keeping score amongst themselves of who got talked about the most. So, well, Kriss,
My
I'm going to
parents
wrap
will
it
be
up.
like, you didn't talk about us at all.
But they're the origin, they're the ones
Yeah,
that gave you the foundation of where you are today,
absolutely.
and had the foresight to purchase the property that you have,
No
which
kidding. Yeah.
is beautiful. So,
Yes.
Kriss,
Thank you.
we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Have a wonderful weekend, and I can't wait for people to hear more about you and your story. So, to everybody out there, thanks so much. Continue to focus on trying to be a better wild game cook. Go out and seek out Kriss Abigail. She will teach you how to get that meat better prepared, so that we can then do that wild game cooking. So, thank you, everybody. Good night and good luck.
I want you to know it's over.
Well, bye.